Good day or good evening, whatever applies to you. Welcome to Creation, Genesis, and Origins. I'm Dick Fisher with my co-host Ken Miller, and we'll explore the origins of mankind from a biological and anthropological perspective and look at where the biblical author began his story. We should recognize that the starting points are not the same. Although some would prefer to believe there are no connections between mankind and the rest of the animal kingdom, there is no support for that idea biologically or genetically. All the evidence from different areas of science falls on the connectedness of life on Earth through common ancestry. What often is termed survival of the fittest, however, was actually survival of the most adaptable. Fossil records show that in the face of extreme climate fluctuations, some early species of the Homo genus overlapped in time instead of evolving linearly from one species into another, and with varying degrees of what we would call human characteristics. Today we'll talk about the history of humans and begin to examine the Genesis record, which we will see is compatible with our present-day scientific understanding and consistent with the history of the ancient Near East.
The Great Rift Valley in Africa, where humans originated, covers 5,400 miles running from the Jordan Valley in the Middle East and taking in the whole of the Red Sea before cutting through Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania, Mozambique, and finally reaching the Indian Ocean near the Zambezi River. It is much more defined in Kenya than anywhere else. It contains 7 lakes which have no outlets, including Lake Turkana, where numerous fossil remains of early man have been found. Evaporation leaves behind a large accumulation of salts and minerals in the lakes. A high alkaline content is a factor that turns bones into fossils. The fossilization process has enabled the Rift Valley to preserve remains of ancient animals and human fossils, affording us valuable information of the ancient past.
As we showed in the previous episode, mankind went through stages of human development, starting with bipedalism 6 million years ago. An upright posture was necessary for their survival, and they began to walk on their short legs in their daily search for food. Paleoanthropologist Richard Leakey has the beginnings of humanity 6 million years ago with the rift in Africa, where our tree-dwelling ancestors were forced down out of the trees as the climate changed from a jungle habitat to a drier savanna environment, where foraging for food and insects on the ground required bipedal locomotion and hands freed for carrying their food back to the safety of the trees.
The Australopithecines, who lived over 3 million years ago, appear to be the first to add meat to their diet, and chasing animals for food required longer legs and a slicker body to chase after wild game. Early humans butchered large animals with stone tools as long as 2.6 million years ago, but they may have also scavenged the kills from lions and other predators. By the time Homo erectus had evolved, hunting for animals as a food source had become a way of life, and meat became a mainstay of these early humans, following herds of wild zebras, reindeer, and maybe even woolly mammoths.
The Pliocene Quaternary glaciation started about 2.5 million years ago during the late Pliocene, when the spread of ice sheets in the northern hemisphere began. This would be during the time of Homo habilis, when man had already begun to use stone tools. Since then, the world has seen cycles of glaciation and ice sheets advancing and retreating on 40,000 and 100,000 year time periods, with glacial advances interspersed with glacial retreats.
During the interglacial periods of warming, animal herds grazing on grass would move further and further north, with human predators picking off slower and feebler members of the herds.
These recurrent drastic cyclical changes in climate were largely responsible for the expansion of humans following the animal herds, with resultant speciation over time from Homo habilis to Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, and finally Homo sapiens, who began about 200,000 years ago. Traces of early humans of our own species have been found as far north as Siberia in their continual search for food.
The use of fire has been estimated to at least 800,000 years. In Yunnan province in China, blackened mammal bones were found and dated to 1.7 million years.
Control of fire provided a new tool with several uses, such as cooking, which led to a fundamental change in the human diet. Cooking released nutrients in foods and made them easier to digest. The earliest hearths are at least 790,000 years old. Some researchers think cooking may reach back more than 1.5 million years. By 500,000 years ago, early humans were making wooden spears and using them to kill large animals. We began to communicate with symbols around 250,000 years ago. Plants and animals were domesticated by 10,000 years ago, and the first cities began to emerge in southern Mesopotamia, present-day Iraq, starting about 7,000 years ago. Well, this is the point in human history where the Genesis narrative begins. The author of Genesis, perhaps Moses, had no knowledge of all the human prehistory that took place up until the point where it became relevant to his people. And the first person of real significance was Adam.
So where did we go wrong? Why did we not understand that from the very beginning, human history is one thing and Genesis history is quite another?
Well, the seeds of theological missteps were sown centuries before Christ with the writings of the great philosophers. Beginning in the 4th century, Latin versions of Plato and Aristotle were read alongside the Latin Vulgate version of the Bible in the monasteries, and through the ages, philosophical thought became intertwined with Christian theology. Empirical and experimental science died on the vine, and perceived problems with the inspired text could presumably be resolved by simply thinking about them. Over the centuries, schools of thought arose concerning the structure of the Trinity, the personhood of Christ, the permanence of salvation, the necessity of baptism, and so on. In general, the ideas that won out were those that seemed to make the most sense, and those that carried the weight of someone deemed important. The belief that Genesis was an abbreviated history of the beginning of the human race was never questioned. When the Apostle Paul set out on missionary trips to plant churches, he would go to the synagogues in each city to search out Jews who would be receptive. For the most part, he was rejected and eventually martyred. Among the monotheistic Jews, the idea that a human person could be God was blasphemous. Yet, Paul found some who'd listen. To the Greeks and Romans, who were largely polytheistic anyway, the idea that Jesus was God was more easily accepted. Early followers of the way were comprised of Romans, Greeks, and converted Jews who would meet weekly, take communion, and read the scriptures aloud. Although a letter or two might be in their possession, the Greek Septuagint version of the Old Testament would get the most attention, and Genesis, the first book, would be a natural place to start. Gathered in a group of followers and hearing the story of Adam and Noah told and retold, Gentiles in the audience would have no inkling their own history could be any different than biblical history. Looking over the shoulders of the Jews, they just read themselves into Jewish history. 2,000 years later, and biblical scholars still haven't figured that out. Not long after Constantine made Christianity respectable, Julian became emperor of Rome and sought to restore paganism by discrediting Roman Christians who proclaimed themselves descendants of Adam. Julian thought by pointing out this flaw in ancestry, he could persuade them their newfound religion was similarly flawed. Fortunately for the course of Christianity, but unfortunately for apologetics, he failed. When the King James translators converted Hebrew into English in 1611, they had the same mindset as early Christians. They thought the entire human race descended from Adam. Noah's flood was global, terminating all human and animal life, that one universal language was spoken by Noah's kin, and their languages were scrambled at the Tower of Babel. Well, this common mistake permeated the King James translation and effectively canonized the tradition. Subsequent translations have modernized the language to some degree, but due to a meager knowledge of the history of the ancient Near East and its applicability, tradition endures unabated. What could be accepted and appreciated as the legitimate history of the Adamic Semitic race is either swallowed whole as human history, complete with illogical absurdities, or rejected under the premise it was invented to portray the history of the entire human race by Hebrew storytellers influenced by Babylonian creation myths and epic tales. This either-or mentality still dominates Christian apologetics today.